pase, pierna derecha, directo al arco, ¡golazo! ¡Golazo!
The world of football with a soccer perspective. This is Soccer Today with Duane, Rollins and Kevin Laramee, live on the Sports Podcasting Network.
Good day, good night. Welcome to Soccer Today for March 1st, 2018. Season is only just a few days away. That's crazy. The Montreal Impact will open their season this Sunday in Vancouver against the Vancouver Whitecaps. A new look Vancouver Whitecaps, and to talk about the Vancouver Whitecaps today on the show from the Back Line, a soccer podcast about the Vancouver Whitecaps, Mark Dailey. Mark, good morning.
Good morning, guys. How's it going?
It's going well, as always. Here, already seen a game live in the city that I'm in, and it's a little bit crazy, live soccer in this country on March 1st, but here we are. Mark, the Vancouver Whitecaps had a kind of plain season last year, for lack of a better way to put it. They weren't bad. They weren't good either. Is there any expectation within the Vancouver fans right now that can go one way or the other this year, or are we expecting something down the middle again?
Well, yeah, that's the $64,000 question there, Duane. I mean, if you look at it, I mean, their season started kind of slow because they put all their eggs basically in the CCL baskets. They had that first of all quarterfinal matchup against New York Red Bulls, and then they picked up a semifinal matchup against Tigres. And that was a big deal for the club. And they didn't really start that hot in the league. And I don't think there's any coincidence that once that the CCL was over, and say also once the Voyageurs Cup was out of the way, a couple of guys really up and going, and Freddie Montero up towards the end of the spring. That's when the season really sort of. The first third of the season was kind of pedestrian. The middle third of the season in the summer into the early fall, I thought was pretty good. And I think they tailed off right towards the end because they're nervous people in Vancouver at the time. But the big disappointment came when they drew Seattle in the playoffs and just did not deliver any sort of threat on the pitch over the course of that two-leg tie.
Yeah, no, for sure. It was difficult, obviously, with what was happening, both in Montreal where things were kind of going off the rails, no offense, Kevin, and here where things were very much on the rails. It became sometimes hard to put a lot of attention on the Whitecaps because they were just kind of there. So tell me, what is exciting you? What's going to be exciting for people watching the Vancouver Whitecaps in 2018 this year?
Well, first of all, I don't think that they're completely done with shaping the squad for 2018. If you look at the news over the past couple of days, that Tim Parker contract holdout or disputes, whatever you want to call it, that seems to be, there's a lot of smoke with that fire, let's put it that way. They signed another fellow that recently played for Orlando City. That's Jose Aja. I'm not sure exactly how to pronounce it yet, but he's a center back. And if you look at all the other guys that they've got at that position, you have Kendall Waston, you have Daniil Henry, you've got Aaron Mond, you've got David Edgar still hanging around the periphery there. So to sign another center back seems pretty indicative that something's up. And also that Tim Parker seems to have been photoshopped out of some of the Whitecaps preseason, what do you want to call it, advertising campaigns. So something's definitely up there. So whether or not this is sort of a temporary measure with this new fellow, that remains to be seen. Yesterday, they sent Tony Tchani off to the Chicago Fire in exchange for, I think it was something like $150,000 in targeted allocation money. So it still looks to me from that point of view that there may be another piece or two coming into the roster, while Robinson still has time. So that's interesting to keep an eye out. And then looking onto the pitch, I think there's a lot of questions, to be quite honest. I mean, the team, as you say, I mean, they had a fairly decent year. I mean, it wasn't maybe as exciting as Toronto FC. So of course, I mean, that was somewhat historic what they managed to do. But I mean, it was a good season in some regards, but worrying in others when they just weren't able to get the job done. But I mean, at the end of the day, they did make the playoffs. But as we just mentioned, they didn't make it too far. So the group of players that they have now, You've got Kai Kamara up top that has come in. I mean, he's a guy that has been linked with the Whitecaps before. You have a new fellow, Anthony Blondell, who's unproven in MLS. Gone is, Christian Bolaños, who's been with the club for the past couple of years. So does this mean we're going to see more of Alphonso Davies this year in a starting role for the Vancouver Whitecaps? And then also Matthias Laab is gone. He's been basically an incumbent in that central defensive midfielder role. And we have a new fellow Mexican guy by the name of Efrain Juarez. So he seems to be the guy that's going to play there. And, of course, David Osted, another guy that was a warrior for the Whitecaps over the past 3, 4, 5 years, was it? I can't remember. For a very long time is gone. And you have Stefan Marinovic, who came in over the summer. Seems to be fighting it out with Brian Rowe for the starting keeper, but I would think that would be the job. So, lots of questions, honestly, guys, and I don't know how it's really going to play out until we see some competitive soccer here starting this weekend.
At least with the departure of Bolaños, it's a month and a half where you'll have the player in your roster this summer when Bolaños goes with Costa Rica to the World Cup. You mentioned Donnell Henry and Kai Kamara, two acquisitions that the Vancouver Whitecaps did in the offseason. You mentioned as well the departure of Tony Chani, and we can add the departure of Montero and Laba and all the names that you just mentioned. When we're looking at the net gains here, what came in, what came out, is Vancouver better now? Or will Vancouver be better in a few weeks? Or are the pieces that left too big to fill?
Yeah, again, that's a great question. I mean, for a team that did make the playoffs and very handily dispatched the San Jose Earthquakes 5-0 in the knockout rounds, there was real hopes that maybe the Whitecaps were getting hot at the right time, because they did struggle down the stretch there a little bit. Anyways, Freddie Montero, who you just mentioned, he was the guy for the Whitecaps last year. I don't think he really got going. I mean, he came in to the team sort of late in the preseason. He wasn't quite match fit. He wasn't really playing a lot of matches in China before he got here. So it really took him a little bit of time to get match fit. And then I think once Jordi Reyna had recovered from that broken foot, I think that's when they started to gel, because it seems like once he was there, then that's when the team really started to get on a roll after Canada Day. So, I mean, the departure of Montero and sort of kind of replace him with Kamara, that's kind of a tough question. I mean, Kamara, I mean, we all kind of know what he's about. I mean, he's been around the league for a while, and he's played in England. I mean, the guy can score goals. And the only reason that Montero didn't come back this year was that they just weren't able to get a deal done. He was only in Vancouver on a 1-year loan. And considering he had a career year for goals in Major League Soccer, it seemed unlikely that they'd be able to get him for maybe the price that they wanted. So I'm not sure exactly how the discussions came down, but it seemed fairly soon into the off season that it was going to be very unlikely that he was going to come back. So the Kamara thing is maybe a surprise to a certain extent, but not really. I mean, his name was linked to the Vancouver Whitecaps even as early as 2016 during the summer there, just prior to when he ended up going to New England. So I guess if those stories are to believe, so the Whitecaps did get their man, but it took a year and a half longer than maybe was expected. So we'll wait and see what that's all about. I mean, the big problem that strikers have typically had is they've not had consistent or quality service. They've just not been able to get the ball provided to them. And with Jordi Reyna there, that seems to really fix that problem to a large extent. So whether or not Kamara can form that sort of relationship, that sort of chemistry with Reyna, really seems to be seen. So that's interesting. And Juarez, that's an interesting one too. I mean, I think that Laba started his career in Vancouver good, and I think like in 2016, like a lot of guys, he really struggled. And last year, I think he bounced back a little bit, but there were rumors for quite a while, even before he got injured, that he was going to be going. He was looking for a transfer to South America, which makes sense. I mean, I believe his wife and his kid were living down there, so he was separated from his family. So from that point of view, it made sense. It was interesting in the fact that when he got injured in that match there, when he ruptured his tendon there in his knee, that he was it really coincided at right about the time where this move to Racing was supposedly to go off. So I had actually expected to maybe see Laba back. I think he was going into his final year of the deal here in Vancouver. So the fact that somebody didn't decide to pick him up and he moved on before that time was a bit of a surprise. But yeah, honestly, guys, there's a lot of questions, and I mean, it's hard to really say if there's net gains or losses. I mean, they look good on paper, but whether or not that transfers to results on the pitch remains to be seen, because preseason, hey, it's preseason. You can go out there one day and win 4-0, and it doesn't really mean anything. I mean, once this weekend the whistle is blown and it gets serious, then that's going to really give us a good indication, and especially against the Impact, which is a big rival for the Whitecaps. I mean, you put in, say, any one of those 4 clubs that the Whitecaps really consider a rival, Toronto, Montreal, Portland, or Seattle, you know that they're going to get jacked up for it. So I think that will be, a good test for them right out of the gate.
Longtime goalkeeper David Ousted has moved on from the Vancouver Whitecaps, and not without controversy. The way this case was handled on expansion draft day and the day before, and what the re-entry draft and all those process, what he was told and what happened are 2 different things. And he actually made a lot of waves publicly. He's letting it out what actually happened and how he was told something, and he made a research with MLS and he figured out he couldn't be a re-entry player, and he was, and he had a big salary, would have had a big bonus as well, and it's one of the reasons why he's not with the Whitecaps. As a longtime follower and reporter of this club, Mark, how do you see this issue? How did Vancouver manage the David Ousted issue?
Personally, I think that if you want to look at it in the simple terms of buying and selling, I think that they sold at the right time. I think that without a doubt, Ousted was an extremely good player for the Whitecaps. I think he was an excellent find. I mean, he made basically an instant impact the moment that he arrived in 2013. But we've seen over, I'd say, the last, 18 months, if not 2 years, that there were some kind of like worrying aspects kind of creeping into his game. He was still able to make those huge game-saving stops, but every once in a while there would be communication issues with the defensive corps, and then other times, I mean, as many good saves that he'd make, there'd be just as many of these goals that he would concede where you'd be like, you know what, I really think he should have stopped that. I mean, a guy that's been this good for this long, he did let in some goals from time to time that were a little bit concerning, to say the least. So, I mean, I kind of hate to say it, but I think that was a good move for the Whitecaps. I mean, I know how popular he was here, but at the end of the day, I think that the signs were there. And I think if you kind of look at if you want to look at a player's career as a bell curve in terms of age and period of time, I think he was just getting to the crest there. In my opinion, anyways, it was maybe just going over the top and maybe onto the downhill side. So that move to get to Marinovic here was interesting because they've never really had, let's say, a backup goalkeeper here that was really one to challenge for a starting spot. I mean, they had Paolo Ternaghi here for several seasons, and I mean, he only, I think, got 1 MLS start in his entire time. The rest of the time he started matches was like in preliminary or early, where they say group stage matches of CCL and say Voyageurs Cup semifinal matches and things like that. So Paolo was never going to push David Ousted for that spot. Then you got Spencer Ritchie, who is in the system, but he's on loan now at FC Cincinnati, which makes sense because Alan Koch used to be the head coach here of the now defunct Whitecaps FC2. Anyway, so he's still around, and he's a goalkeeper that Robinson really, I think, is really high on for the future. But Marinovic, I think, really has to be the guy. I mean, he had a very good Confederations Cup in 2017, so that was part of the reason I think that he was almost instantly recognized by a lot of the fans here. And it really kind of made me wonder what was up at the time there, because I'm like, this is not the typical kind of guy that they bring in. So I don't think that it was maybe the signs were that Ousted wasn't going to be back at that point. But definitely, I think at that time, they brought in a guy to maybe really push for it. So they've made their choice now. They've stuck with Marinovic. So for better or worse, he's the guy, and whether or not he's going to be able to get the job done, we'll find out pretty good. But we saw, especially down the stretch there last season, in the big matches, Marinovic was getting the starts all the time, and by and large he delivered, and he can make some pretty big game-changing saves, just like Osted was capable of. So it's the ball's in his court now, so to speak.
You mentioned, Mark, that the Whitecaps fans have four big rivals that they consider, in some degree of order: Seattle, Portland, Montreal, Toronto. You've seen three of those four win championships over the past few years, and two at least, and if not, and two at least, and not just three, or possibly three, maybe even four, depending on what you think of Montreal's spending habits. Well, I even throw Drogba in there. You've seen them all spend huge. So with that considered, how satisfied are Whitecaps fans overall with the management and direction of the team right now, do you feel?
Well, over the past couple of years, the Whitecaps have really had this ethos of scouting out players that's maybe under the radar, and really rather spending less money and scouting better rather than going out and paying big bucks and getting a guy that's, say, proven to do it. I had a conversation with Carl Robinson last spring, and I asked him that exact question. He said, if you look at guys like Javinko and David Villa, these guys that are, paying like, I guess they're, I can't remember the numbers he used. I think it was something like 15 or 20 million. Let's toss that out there as an example. He said, what you're going to get from a guy like that. You know what he's going to bring to the table. You know what he's going to produce. He said where they're kind of looking is in that smaller look. He said, for say players in, say, that $1 to $2 to $3 million range, which is quite a big gap in terms of I guess quality of a player between, say, a Javinko and somebody less than that. He said, it's a big gamble at times, but be that as it may, that's the route that they've chosen to go, and they've definitely had some hits and misses. But when you look at the evolution of MLS over the past couple of years, and you look at your teams like your LA Galaxies, your New York City FCs, your Torontos, your Seattles of the world, and they're not afraid to spend the money. And the one thing you can criticize the Whitecaps of is that they've decided to be fiscally responsible. They've decided on this model, and they've stuck with it. And I think that the big question is now, is that model going to be useful, I suppose, going forward? Are they going to be able to remain competitive? Because, if you look at the squad now compared to the squad that took to the pitch and that was on the bench on the last game against Seattle last year, there's basically wholesale changes. So whether or not this approach is going to work is a great question, because there is pressure on the club, because as you mentioned, Duane, Portland's won MLS Cup, Seattle's won MLS Cup, Toronto's won an MLS Cup. Toronto and Seattle, they've been in the past two MLS Cup finals, and then if you throw in things as well like the Voyageurs Cup, which is something that the Whitecaps have only been able to win once. So when they won it in 2015, that was a huge deal for them. So there is pressure on them. So whether or not that they're going to be forced to spend more money, whether they're able to spend more money, that's a completely different question. But I think that this will really be, I think to a certain degree, a make or break year that will really prove like how this model, this spending, the way that they spend and scout players is really going to, really prove or disprove itself. So I don't know. I'm really of the mind that they can't go on the way that they have. I think at some point they are going to have to open the purse strings a little bit more.
In the world, if you look at the overall world's game, there are teams that are able to sort of get around their spending deficits by being great developers of talent, not just seeking out and finding players that have been developed elsewhere and bringing them in at a cheaper price and then developing them further, but actually developing their own players. Obviously, Vancouver has Alphonso Davies. You can argue one way or the other how much of his is just raw talent and how much the Whitecaps developed. But you mentioned it a moment ago, they've scrapped their USL team. It seems to me from an outside perspective that maybe, especially when I look at the amount of players that have truly graduated through their academy system over the years and truly had an impact there, that we're not getting that kind of return there. So in light of the fact that the Whitecaps FC, or forget what they were actually called, the USL team, is no longer, is there starting to be some criticisms of about maybe more rhetoric than actual results when it comes to the academy system, because Lenarduzzi is famous for talking about how they develop players and how they have the academy there and they were the first in and so on and so forth. Are you starting to hear criticisms there, or is it still so far under the radar that only the hardest of the hardcore are talking about it?
Yeah, I think it's probably the latter. I mean, I was a big proponent, and my partner Jorge as well. We're big fans, big proponents and supporters of the USL program, and they still have an affiliation with the USL team. So that would be the team that's going to start playing down in Fresno this year. So I think that they have some deal that I think that 7 players on the roster there will have to be Whitecaps FC players, but I mean it's completely different than basically fielding an entire team full of players that were your own guys. I mean, and the way that they had it set up, they have their training facility out at UBC. They have Thunderbird Stadium there. I mean, you had the first team and the USL team basically working together, and I thought, this is it here. You have you basically. The two teams on different sides of the hallway in the training facility and different locker rooms, and it's simply put, of course, but this great opportunity for them to work together. So I think it probably came down to a lot of it just the operating costs, and I think that's disappointing. But at the end of the day, I mean, 2 years or 3 years, I guess, is how many years that they gave it. Was that really enough to develop some players and expect to see how many players kind of like percolate up to the first team? I mean, you saw Brett Levi, who's in the first team. I mean, we love Brett. I mean, he's a great player, great guy, Canadian guy. And so, I mean, that's great to see. It's disappointing to see Adekube move on over the winter, but not really too much of a surprise. I think with some of the injuries that he's had over the past couple of years, I think that the window maybe kind of closed on his opportunity in Vancouver, and he had some loan periods in Europe, most notably at Brighton and Hove Albion. He was there for quite a while. But at the end of the day, I mean, you take Alphonso Davies, and I mean, I don't really know how to really factor Alphonso into the equation. I mean, sure, he's a Whitecaps player. I mean, sure, he's been here for a couple of years, but I mean, he's just kind of like one of those once in a generation kind of, I don't want to call him a freak, but I mean, he is for his age. I mean, he's extraordinarily physically mature. I mean, mentally, I mean, the way that he sees the game, the way that he processes the game when he's on the field is, I mean, it's like 10 years beyond his age, and just the skills that he has is unbelievable. So, I mean, I think that, of course, that the Whitecaps would love to produce players like that, but I'm sure so would Barcelona, so would Manchester United. I mean, you don't get a lot of guys like Alphonso Davies coming through every day in every single system, but I think that they haven't really developed as many as they had. They wanted to, at least at this point. I mean, at the end of the day, I mean, you've got basically Alphonso, and you've got Brett Levi, and then Russell Tybert. I mean, God bless him. I mean, he's been around for years, and he signed another contract this past winter for I guess the next 3 years, next 2 years and an option, something like that. So I'd like to see it continue, but it's kind of interesting to see how that kind of fits into the larger picture. And guys, that could be a show all unto of itself, just how that whole youth development fits into not just Vancouver, but also Toronto, Montreal, or basically any other team in the league. I guess Dallas would be the shining example of a club that's been able to develop and get their own players onto the pitch consistently over the past couple of years.
Yeah, that's true, but then they lose to a Panamanian team in the CONCACAF Champions League. But that's another topic for another day. Mark, we want to thank you very much for your time today. And where can listeners find your work?
You guys can find us on Apple Podcasts. Just search us for From the Back Line. You can find us on Twitter at From the Back Line, and we've got a new show comes out every single week. And we're basically getting geared up. We've been going all year long, but we're up and running for the season. So new show will be coming out for us tonight or tomorrow morning, and then that'll be it. We'll be rocking and rolling for the entire year. So thanks for the opportunity, guys. I really enjoyed it.
Always a pleasure, Mark, and we'll be right back after the break with some Vancouver talk. Still a little bit more importantly, or more Toronto and Montreal as well.
You are listening to Soccer Today. Follow us on Twitter at SoccerTodaySPN and like our Facebook page, facebook.com/Sports Podcasting Network. You can find the podcast version of all the shows we do on iTunes, Apple Podcast, Google Play Store, TuneIn Radio, iHeartRadio, and anywhere you get your podcast.
And we're back on Soccer Today. Duane Rollins with myself, Kevin Laramee, and from Vancouver, let's move to Montreal, Duane.
Well, yeah, they are playing each other on Sunday, which is going to be an interesting match. You mentioned yesterday, Kevin, the way we kind of do this is we'll sort of interview each other. So I'll start with you. The injury that we talked about yesterday and the changes to the back line. Yeah, I know it's terrible for him and for the club.
He's out for the
obviously.
season. It's 4 to 5 months, but he's out for the season. That's terrible.
Well, the time you get back to fitness, yeah, and fit in too, that was the other part of it. And this is always the risk that when they came in is that you're trying to overhaul the back line, which really was a strength of the team a couple of years ago. So I'm not sure why they decided to change there so much. But at any rate, that's my question to you: was that a mistake? Was that? Should they have, kept Simon around for another year? Well, in hindsight, it's 2020. But
Simon was, I don't want to say overrated, but Simon's contributions were there. But when you have to do spectacular trackbacks and slide tackles to correct a mistake to begin with, how much of it is good defending and how much of it is just repairing a mistake? I'm not saying it was always the case, but I'm saying there's different ways to analyze a situation. And the way Rémi Garde wants to play, the way he wants his locker room to be, it's not just about the player, it's about the player in the environment, in the team, how the behavior, the group component. And when you're moving on to a different group, a different coaching staff, a different mentality you want your team to have maybe, or a different communication level, maybe a different communication bridges that are not burned, well, you move on to other things. So the moving on of Laurent Simon is not just about the play on the pitch. Yes, you had some talent in Cal Fisher and other players like Ari Diallo that you were expecting, but because of injuries, they're not there. And of course, you already had the idea of loaning Thomas Meyer-Giguère to Ottawa for the entire season, which was announced yesterday. Same for Michael Salazar. Has been loaned to Ottawa for the 2018 season. So it's a short-term problem right now for Montreal because of the injury to Zakaria Diallo and others. You will have a Duval probably working in the center back position for the next few weeks until there's a more permanent solution that is found. You have Raitala that might be a factor as well, and you do have left back Daniel Lovitz will be there, and you have other options for the right back position. But yes, it is a blow to the defense right now. But I think the transition away from the old defense of a few years ago was due to many factors. The retirement of Asun Kamara. There's the Laurent Simon kind of controversy that happened like a year and a half ago, and there were maybe more to that fire behind the scenes, a more relationship that have broken down than we're aware of. We're not privy to that situation fully. So his reaction since then might give you an opinion and a window into what actually happened. So I think there's more reason than meets the eye for why this defense has been different. And, well, you kind of have to do what you got for the next few weeks until Adam Braz and company gets a more permanent solution to take over for Zakaria Diallo. Because it's basically your starter in the center back position with maybe Victor Cabrera that got injured.
Kevin, I think that it's fair to say that there was a change in direction for the Impact over the offseason. I mean, obviously the new manager, the top management stayed the same, but that's always the case in Montreal. But the new manager comes in, they get rid of some players that were well associated with this. There was a retirement of Patrice Bernier. It is kind of turning a leaf this year. And when you look at not to compare to when you look to compare to how other championship teams have been built, there's not a hard and fast rule, but you look at the example down the highway, they took 3 years. And that first year was kind of a transition year. They sort of made some mistakes and they figured them out, but they got some key pieces that remained their part into the championship year. Is it fair to sort of look at what Montreal's trying to do right now and think that this year's not necessarily a throwaway year, but a transition year where maybe they might not be exactly where they'd like to finish, but you can start that building block towards what might be a championship team in 3 years or so?
Yeah, I think so. But instead of using the word transition here, I'm going to use the word discovery. I think it's a discovery year. I think it's the year where Rémi Garde discovers this year. And I want to use New York City FC as an example and Patrick Vieira in his first year. You did see some results, some great results in the regular season. You did see some shortcomings in the playoff. You did see some great results, sometimes great decision by the coach at the result, and sometimes the coach's decision led to a loss instead of a win. And I do feel we'll see the same thing in Montreal this year, because the coaching staff is discovering the league, its intricacies in their rules, and the loopholes, and the tam and gams, and all the different things you could do. So there's the discovery aspect. There's, like you mentioned, a changing of the guard, or no pun intended with Rémi Garde, by the way, but there's a different mentality as well at the type of soccer this team wants to play. The look of the team, how it plays, the positive soccer instead of counterattack soccer, if you follow what I'm saying, is there's a difference. Not saying it's solely focused on possession, but there's a more aspect of going forward, of creating, building, construction of play. Those key aspects that we used to put in the identity of play, those have been worked on. And there's a very big focus on the training camp so far in fitness. Because if you look at the Montreal Impact last year, late in games, it became a meme and as well as a trope at the end of the season. The Montreal Impact lost a lot of points, about 19 late in games. And that fitness aspect has been addressed, and just the hiring of Robert Duane, who is one of the best strength and conditioning preparator in the entire world of football, with the French national team in Lyon over the last 2 decades. You do have that aspect being addressed, and you've seen results. Just look at the players and their face and their jawline and their lack of quote-unquote baby fat behind the jaw that you used to see. You see a lot of players have a different look to them after just a few weeks of working under Robert Duane. So I do feel some problems will be taken care of, or the problem that they analyzed and saw a few things they could adjust, like fitness and like identity of play. But I think the year of discovery will find other things that Rémi Garde and his staff would not have anticipated, and they can tweak a little bit of what they think about this league, of how to approach and how to win in this league. And next year and the year after, we might see, like you mentioned, like the Toronto plan, where the further along it came after 2 years, you saw that after the big loss in the first year in the playoffs against Montreal, and you had that chip on their shoulder of having that defeat to go forward. I think it's important that thing happens again, and Rémi Garde will discover this league, how to take advantage of what he knows about his experience of the world of soccer outside of MLS, and where he can get advantage of that, like Patrick Vieira did. And I think we will see in 18 months' time a very different, not necessarily different players or different team, but a different in the way it handles himself on the pitch and the confidence level than we do see the Impact now. But yes, 2018 is a transition/discovery year.
All right. We'll save the actual prediction of where they finish and things like that for tomorrow's overall prediction show. But I do want to sort of gauge the community right now. Famously, Joey Saputo has been critical of his own fans. Reminds me of the hockey owner in Ottawa a little bit when it comes to that sometimes you're biting the hand that you want to feed you. But nonetheless, that certainly has been something that's been out there, and there have been some, I wouldn't call them struggles, but disappointments, attendance disappointments at times in Montreal over the past few years, with a few glaring examples of great moments too, which I think is why they become disappointing. We, I think, inarguably are at the lowest point of Montreal sports history overall since probably probably since the year the Expos left would be the only other, but by the time the Expos left, they were rolling the dead body out of the city at that point, right? So
by the time they left, they were playing half their games in San Juan, Puerto Rico. So yeah, of course. But it's true. It's a terrible year to be a Montreal sports fan.
So this is my question to you. You know, is this a loss of opportunity for the Impact or a lucky break that the Impact might struggle a little bit this year when everyone else is struggling? So it just blends.
Yeah, and the other two teams are struggling even more. So maybe it is a lucky break where you'd be like, yeah, but it could be worse. We could be the Alouettes. Or, we could be the Montreal Canadiens. It ain't too bad. But no, I think with the... You know, you have to be honest with yourself here. And Joey Saputo have been laying it. You have been saying it quite, like, not necessarily outright, but he's been trying to remind people that, look, we're not Toronto. We don't necessarily have those funds. We can't spend that amount of money because we don't generate that amount of money. And our owners, as much as the Saputo family in itself has a lot of money, that's not who owns the Montreal Impact. It's Joey Saputo himself. And not saying he doesn't have any money, but who are we to tell him how he manages his money? And at some point, he invested over $150 million in this club since the early 2000s, since ever. So at some point, he wants to have some dividends coming from it, and it's not the case yet. So the justification for expenses like a Toronto FC and MLSC would do is not there. So you have to remind people that, yeah, this is not a big club. It's not New York, and we're not Toronto, and we're not LA. So for a mid-table / small Major League Soccer franchise, the Montreal Impact has been able to do some great things over the last few years in playoffs and run and CCL, but it's still not done. The building of this club, the fidelization, the retaining of customers, the growing of the customer base, increasing it is not over. And sometimes it has to be treated like brand new every year to try to get new fans in and not just rely on the fans that are there and asking them to fork out more money. So there is that aspect that even though we're going into the 7th season of the Montreal Impact in Major League Soccer, there's still a lot of work to be done, and it's an ever-evolving work to be done that still needs to be done, that you still need to do in 100 years from now and 200 years from now. Has to be closer to the community, has to be a bit more involved in the habits of the day-to-day of the population, and it will eventually. And Major League Soccer is a league where it's difficult to get season tickets to 50% of your capacity. So that's where the Impact actually always aim is about 10,000, and it's hard to get to 10,000. But majority of the games, even last year when it was terrible, there was a lot of sold out. There were a lot of games sold out. And when we look at the Canadians, they've been here forever. There's as many people at the Bell Center as there is at the Stade Saputo. Yes, there's a lot more Bell Center games in a season. So yearly, there's more fans going to see the Montreal Canadiens. But you do have 20,000 plus people at Stade Saputo on most nice weather day. And it's more than you can say for a lot of franchises. It's just the cost effectiveness, the money in Canadian dollars. There's a lot of factors that explains why the Montreal Impact are not to the level of a TFC, but it's something the Montreal Impact fan needs to keep in mind is even though we like to compare ourselves to Toronto, we should look a little south and maybe compare ourselves to like an Orlando.
Yeah, look, I mean, I'll answer my question. I think it's actually a good thing that this is happening because let's face it, the fact that the Montreal Canadiens traded a player to the Toronto Maple Leafs the other day to help the Toronto Maple Leafs push to perhaps going deep in the playoffs while they have to sit back and miss the playoffs again. The fact that the Montreal Canadiens are very likely to fire their general manager and probably coach too sometime soon too based on a disappointing season. The fact that there's no end in sight to the pain that team's going under right now is going to dominate the sports coverage in that city, which is going to allow the Impact of any success they have is going to be seen as perfectly good. So I think it's actually good that there's a distraction that's dominating that city in a way that we haven't seen in a while. But that wasn't me rubbing it in. I actually have nothing against the Habs. I'm a rare Torontonian that way. But at any rate, why don't you switch gears and you can ask me a few TFC questions to end the show, a long day of podcasting.
Let's move to BMO Field. We're now in Toronto. We're on level 200 here with Toronto in the background. Duane, 2 years in a row, MLS Cup's been in Toronto. Toronto lost one, won one. There's a new scarf that says you won effing everything. that's I've seen floating out there. There's one thing left to win. Is it possible? Is the CCL possible? Is Tigres too much? Because as much as we want to talk about the game of Toronto and Columbus Saturday afternoon, I'm looking at next Wednesday and Tigres and Toronto in Toronto.
No, for sure. That's the greater attention in the city right now is to the game next week, not the game on 2 days. I think there's an expectation that they should be able to maximize their points at home in MLS during the season. I think they might even see, as we said in the last couple of days, you might even see a bit of a squad rotation over the next couple of days. Can they win the competition? That was your question to me directly. I'm not ignoring the answer. My answer to you is that I believe that, okay, I'm going to give one of my famous percentages here next. I would give TFC a 10% chance of winning the CCL, which is 1 in 10 times. Had the draw gone a little bit differently and they didn't have to go through the current Liga MX champions, the greatest MLS Liga MX, I'm going to just speak English, Liga MX team that in history in Club America, if they do in fact get past Tigres, and then likely a third Liga MX team after that, then that's very difficult for me to see happen. I think they can beat Tigres. They can beat Club America. They can beat, let's say, Chivas, for lack of a better, or Monterrey, I believe, the other team on that side.
Tijuana.
They could at any given time. Apologies for every. But anyway, it doesn't matter. They're interchangeable in many ways, right?
Yeah.
That in any given year they could beat them once or maybe even twice, but to have to win 3 in a row, it's highly unlikely. But I do give them a chance simply because it is a priority for them. The Mexican teams do tend to sometimes take a little. They might, especially this first round. Tigres still might look at them as a plus team and say, we can kind of lay it up a little bit, and they could get behind. They could go, oh dear, we're down 3-0 or something like that, and then have to chase a game, right? That is something I could see happen, but I don't think they're ready. I don't think MLS is ready is the question. If TFC only has a 10% chance of doing 3 Mexican teams in a row, then the rest of the league has that famous 1% chance, right? The league needs to get to the point where you're not just having 3 DPs, you're having 7 DPs on the field, because that's realistically, in any given Liga MX team you're playing, there's 3 or 4 guys that we haven't even really heard of that could absolutely be, at the very least, TAM players on a typical MLS team. And many of them could come in at like one of those low-level DP players and be great in MLS. That's the blunt reality. MLS is still a ways behind Liga MX. And to think TFC can win 3 in a row, even the best MLS team of all time, is not completely realistic.
We've talked about Toronto's new players and their performance in the CCL over the last 2 days. Major League Soccer is, of course, an objective for Toronto. Of course, the Supporters' Shield and MLS Cup will be what they're going after. What I'm wondering is, when you have basically, yes, MLS Cup and Supporters' Shield are the same competition, so I'll count them as one, because they're not at the same time, too. You have the CCL. You have the MLS that starts. And you have as well Voyageurs Cup in a few months. Is the Voyageurs Cup will be the one where they're literally playing TFC 2? And is there a chance that Vancouver, Montreal, or Ottawa goes deep in this competition instead of Toronto? Or are you seeing the Voyageurs Cup still as a goal for Toronto? What I'm saying is, something's got to give. Is it the Voyageurs Cup?
Well, when you look at what the Voyageurs Cup is to TFC Brass's belief system, I guess, is I don't necessarily think they look at it as a goal onto its own. They'll talk a good talk about it. They'll put it in the trophy case. They had it on the floats. They have it in the team pictures. Obviously, they'll, when it goes around and tours the supporters groups this off season, all 3 were there. So it's a trophy. But I think realistically, if you went deep inside Bill Manning's head, he would view the Voyageurs Cup as an extension to the CCL, and the CCL very much is part of the team's goals. So I don't think they're going to completely throw a TFC 2 team out in this, especially in a final. And I'm not being presumptive when I suggest that they should be able to get past Ottawa in that. Well, you assume Ottawa is going to beat the League One or PLSQ team, and then you would assume Toronto will beat Ottawa, right? So you're looking at a final. So really you only have to put your main players out for 2 games at that point. They've changed the schedule to allow to sort of ease that schedule congestion, which used to really impact how the MLS teams treated the Voyageurs Cup. So I would be pretty surprised if I'd be pretty surprised if you saw an exact first team lineup against the Fury. You'll probably see a mixture of, guys that aren't getting a lot of time in MLS. Your Ashton Morgans, your, Endos, your the Irwins, the players that are Jordan Hamilton. You'll see those kind of players out there, but you'll see, like they did with the Fury last year, Michael Bradley and Sebastian Javenko were on the bench. They were hopefully going to have a rest day, but against that, in that second leg, the Fury were really pushing back hard, and they obviously lost that first leg. They said, you know what, we're just going to put Seb out here and see what happens for a little bit, right? And they managed to get through that. So they're going to manage that competition, but as I said, they view it as an extension of the CCL. They can't get to the CCL. They can't win the CCL if they don't qualify for it. So they're not going to punt it. Is there a chance? Yeah, of course there's a chance. It's a 2-game series, and lots of weird things have happened in the Voyageurs Cup over the years. It's what makes it so fun. And this might be the last. Well, it'll probably be the second last year. I suspect that we won't have full integration of the Canadian Premier League next year in the Voyageurs Cup, much to people's disappointment. So
we're
running out of
right?
time for.
I imagine by the time 2019 will roll around, we'll have the beginning of the Canadian Premier League and how that unfolds, and the second year when it's established and when you have time to, because it takes a year and a half just to change the format of like the Voyageurs Cup, the Canadian Championship tournament, just because of the time it takes to set up everything, right? You have to do the year prior for it. So I think maybe 2020, you're right, we'll see the, not necessarily quote-unquote open style like FA Cup, but at least closest thing that we've seen to that with the Canadian Premier League and with the quote-unquote D3 semi-pro League One and PLSQ and hopefully a BC one by then.
Yeah, I don't want to speculate too much, but I suspect you'll still see buys for a few years for the 3 MLS teams pretty deep into the competition, where you'll be having a competition below the MLS to have. Sorry, I just said the MLS. I just had people yell at me. Below MLS to have. I suspect you'll have some kind of bracket which has one team qualify from the Canadian Premier League and the lower divisions below that to add to the semifinals for a couple of years, and that's going to not make people happy, but it's probably more realistic than what you could have otherwise. So yeah, we'll see, but that's a little bit off kilter when it's coming to TFC, Kevin. Yeah.
Yes, and we'll wrap today's show by saying come back tomorrow 10 a.m. for Soccer Today's now 3rd annual prediction show. We'll predict our MLS Cup champions, our trophies, our players, our awards. We'll predict the standings, what we think the table is going to look like, what we think the clubs that we follow closely will do, and even the one that we don't. We'll talk through our hat, and we'll make predictions that usually are wrong, but, well, we're right the last few years.
Absolutely, and that's going to do it for today, Kevin. We'll touch base in the next little bit, figure that show out exactly, and it's always fun. Save it if you want. It's funny. I used to, when I get mistakes wrong, when I'd make predictions that didn't turn out, I used to get a lot of retweets for those. But I, funnily enough, didn't get a lot of retweets for my old predictions when I was absolutely right last year. Yeah. Why was that, I wonder?
Why was that? Because, well, you were right, exactly. And you can follow Duane on Twitter at 24th Minute and myself at Kev Laramee. You can listen to Soccer Today live Monday to Friday. Sometimes on Thursday we'll have 5 Rings at 10 a.m. as well. But yeah, Monday to Friday, you have a show on youtube.com/sports podcast network, and your support is greatly appreciated. Do like Steve O'Reilly, do like Chris, like Don, like Mathieu, like Dino, and like almost 30 other great, amazing persons who contribute to the well-being of the hosts, Duane and I, of the well-being of the show, and support us financially with patreon.com/sports podcast network. Take the pledge. $1 a month is enough to qualify for the beginning of our Patreon only show later this month. Yes, we're coming back with something some of you missed a lot, but it will be for Patreons only. So patreon.com/sportspodcast network to make sure you get the brand new show we're going to do soon. And as always, until next time, for Duane Rollins, I'm Kevin Laramee. Have a nice soccer. And a great soccer.
You can find the podcast version of all the shows we do on iTunes, Apple Podcast, Google Play Store, TuneIn Radio, iHeartRadio, and anywhere you get your podcast.